Good afternoon, everyone. This is Phil Corin, and I'm here with Wendy Atkinson, and we are going to be talking about the buyer's repair addendum and the seller's response. And we'll pull those up on the screen in a little bit, but right now what you have in front of you is the addendum itself, or excuse me, not the addendum, the outline. And so that's what we're going to be following, and hopefully you have that perhaps in a hard copy, but we're going to be following that as best we can. When Wendy and I were talking about this in preparation, it became clear that talking about these two forms in and of itself is fairly difficult in a vacuum. And what we decided is we wanted to talk about generally inspection issues and how to deal with them, and also the inspection provisions both in the sale agreement and then in the inspection addendum. So to start, we're going to have a little discussion, what I call a war story, and it relates primarily to the whole issue of inspections and how you deal with them in a sort of an 11th hour sense. Several years ago, I was brought into a case in which the transaction was ready to close. Literally, they were at the altar ready to close. And shortly before the closing event itself, the seller found a leak in the laundry room window. And this was, I think, a two-story home, laundry room window down at the ground level, and just an innocuous little dripping of water going down that window. And since closing was imminent, and obviously the agents, the brokers were interested in closing the transaction, they apparently made a decision or a recommendation to just go ahead and close the transaction with an addendum that would say essentially that the seller, after closing, the seller would pay for the cost to fix the water leak or repair the water leak, something like that. And so that's what happened. The parties went on their way. Seller moved out. The leak continued. Seller was paying for inspectors to come up and find the source of the leaks. And about 3 or 4 inspections later, it was clear that nobody could figure out the source of the leak. And as a result, it became more and more problematic. And finally, the buyer just said, I'll take it from here. Buyer got some kind of a specialist, and the specialist looked at the water leak and figured out that the source of the leak was actually not some innocuous little pinhole in the siding or something, but actually the sliding glass door to the kitchen was being perforated, or had been perforated, and there was water going through, and it was going underneath the linoleum or whatever the flooring was in the kitchen. So the entire kitchen was saturated, super saturated with water, and this little leak was the first evidence of that. So the result was that this wasn't just a simple little fix-it. It was a transaction, or I should say a repair of significant magnitude, because the buyer took the position that the cause of the problem was sliders throughout the entire house. And since this house was perched up on a hill and had lights-out views of Mount Hood, the buyer decided that they want all of the sliders, big, huge sliders, $75,000 worth of sliders repaired or replaced. So that's an example and a cautionary tale about how important it is, number one, to deal with 11th hour events seriously, keeping in mind that water always wins, and that eventually what may be a small problem, if Murphy's Law kicks in, it'll be a big problem, and that's the case. So with that kind of a scenario in mind, we want to talk about then repairs and buyer requested repairs. But before I do, Wendy, how would you say that in the situation that I just discussed or described, how would you like to have seen that put together right before closing?
I can't imagine recommending to either client that that transaction should close before the investigation was complete into what was actually causing the water leak, especially when you're dealing with water. Like you said, water always wins. Water can be really unpredictable. So I would have definitely recommended an extension on closing while we investigated and figured out what the seller was really facing. But if and obviously I wasn't a party to this transaction, but if, let's say, we had a buyer and seller who were adamant that they absolutely had to get this thing closed right now, I would have been doing a big disclaimer and an addendum that survives closing that had some hold harmless language in it, and made sure that they both knew what kind of risk they were taking. Sometimes just presenting something like that will change people's urgency level and make them reconsider. What a horrible story.
That's yeah. That there were on several different levels. I believe that everybody failed, and I don't know for sure who was primarily responsible. But you don't write an addendum that says that the seller is going to repair or fix or whatever a particular problem if the scope of the problem isn't known.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's issue number one. Because while the seller may have signed up for ostensibly $1,000 little water leak repair, they didn't sign up for $75,000 repair claim for replacing all of the sliders in the house.
No.
So that's number one. And secondly, like Wendy says, clearly, if at all possible, try to get a short reset of the closing date. I can't think of any reason other than, shall we say, a loan lock that goes expiring or something like that, that you shouldn't at least say, let's take a step back here and evaluate the scope of the problem, and then once we know the scope of the problem, then get something drafted and probably drafted perhaps by legal counsel, reviewed by seller and buyer, so that we can figure out whether or not this solution is one that will work going forward. Can you imagine, for example, as it was in this case, seller had moved to Seattle. Seller was having to contract with inspectors and contractors and so on down in Portland and making arrangements for access when the seller no longer owned the property. So, as I say, on several levels, the ball was seriously dropped. Okay, so now I think what I'd like to do before we get into these forms is, since we're talking about repairs, these are repairs obviously that are called out by inspections, and I believe everybody's aware that there's two different inspection protocols that can be secured or followed. One of them is in the sale agreement itself, and that's the licensed professional inspection section of the sale agreement. And the other alternative is to use the professional inspection addendum. That's OREF Form 058. And so before we launch into the seller requested or buyer requested repairs and seller response, Wendy, let's talk about these two different approaches to inspections. Which do you prefer, by the way?
I prefer the language that's actually in the sale agreement versus the professional inspection contingency form.
And that's because of why?
I like the latitude that the professional inspection standard language in the form provides, wherein the buyer can actually have multiple inspections without having to go back to the seller to ask permission. If you read the language in there, it says specifically that the buyer can have one or more licensed professionals inspect the property, which means that if they have that whole home inspection and the inspector calls out the roof, they can have a roof inspector come out, and they don't have to go back to the seller and ask for permission to do that, or a pest and dry rot inspection, or whatever might be called out by the home inspector. The professional inspection contingency form actually requires the agent to identify each of the potential inspections that they want to have. And so it kind of becomes a toss-up between, do you mark just the whole home inspection, unless you already know about some other specific inspection you want, and then go back and ask permission for anything else that comes up, or do you mark every box and scare the pants off the seller?
Yeah. What are you seeing in your area in Central Oregon as to which is used?
I actually see primarily the standard language used. It does tend to run, and this makes sense, I think, in our industry. It tends to run from company to company fairly consistently. Certain managing brokers recommend specific forms, and the agents in that company tend to utilize the same ones primarily. But more often than not, I'm seeing just the standard language.
So when the professional inspection addendum is being used, what have you seen in regards to how it's filled out? It looks like there's got to be about, I don't know, 15 different possible inspections.
It's funny you ask that, because I actually do see one extreme or the other. You would think maybe this form would be used because the buyer has maybe had a bad experience with pests, and so they want to call out a pest and dry rot inspection. So we use this form so that we're putting the seller on notice for that. But typically what I see is either just the whole home inspection is marked or every box is marked. It's one extreme or the other.
And so if one box is marked, or one or two, as you're saying, then the issue becomes what happens if down the road the buyer decides, or is another form of inspection is recommended. So the buyer actually has to go back to essentially amend the professional inspection addendum, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And get the seller's consent. And the seller doesn't have to give consent.
Right. So maybe I don't want my roof inspected.
Yeah. You had the opportunity to call it out, Mr. Buyer. You didn't do it. That's your problem, not mine. The inspection contingency period is continuing to run. So this is probably, in my opinion, the most critical juncture, at least one of the most, but perhaps the most critical juncture in the entire real estate transaction, and that is the handling of the events that occur in the inspection contingency period. Because I think, as everybody knows, and we'll talk about the text of that next, is that the professional inspection itself is to occur within the inspection contingency period, but also the negotiations for repairs. Let me read it. Buyer, and I'm looking at the portion in the sale agreement that provides for this, but I believe the text is exactly the same in the addendum. Buyer understands that buyer understands, let's see, where are we? Buyer shall have blank business days, 10 if not filled in, after the date buyer and seller have signed and accepted this agreement, here and after the inspection period, in which to complete all inspections and negotiations with seller regarding any matters disclosed in any inspection report. Now, that essentially requires an awful lot of activity in a relatively short period of time. Do you, Wendy, have you seen many buyers request more time than the standard default period of 10 days?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, I'm recommending our agents ask for somewhere between 13 and 15 business days. Primarily because it's hard to get home inspectors right now, so you eat up 3 or 4 or 5 of your business days just waiting on an inspector. And then if there are any repairs, the time frame to get a professional out to give a quote is unbelievable. Sometimes it can't even be done that quickly, but definitely safer to be more than 10 days. Now, that wasn't the case 3 years ago. 10 days was more than adequate to get all of that done because we had plenty of contractors with nothing to do, but not today. So, yeah, we're seeing more of that. So I love how our forms are constructed, that we have that flexibility where there's some sort of guideline that helps everybody have a relative point of what's reasonable, but we can pick and choose.
Yeah. You know, this reminds me of a situation that I saw a while back where the buyer asked for, let's say, 15 business days as opposed to the 10, and the seller, obviously prompted by the listing agent, said no, 10 business days is standard, that's all you're getting. Well, 10 business days is not standard. 10 business days is a default period that we pulled out of the air when we wrote the form. It seemed like a reasonable thing at the time, but as Wendy pointed out, it all depends upon the market. And if the market is slow, then you're going to have access to inspectors and contractors much easier than otherwise. So for the buyer agents out there, my recommendation is don't be shy about putting in a period of time that is longer than the 10 business days. And plus, as we'll talk about later, invariably, you're going to be bumping up against the deadline anyway. If you do 10 business days, you're probably going to be in a position ultimately of having that, requesting that it be extended.
Yeah, unless everything came back perfect on that home inspection.
Which no self-respecting inspector is going to do that. They're not going to bless that house and say, you know, as hard as I tried, I couldn't find anything wrong with this house.
I haven't seen that happen in my experience.
It doesn't happen. So put a little extra time in, and for the listing agents, keep in mind that it's far better to keep the transaction together without having the buyer trying to get extensions of time. If you put in 15 days to begin with, then it may eliminate the need to get an extension of the inspection period, and everybody will be happy, and seller won't be feeling put upon that things are being extended beyond what they originally agreed to. So just keep that in mind. And then, of course, the other component, which we'll talk about later, is the negotiations. You've got the inspection period, and then you've got the negotiations. What would you say about getting, you obviously want to use a good inspector, but is it possible, does it occur where you call up the inspector? Let's say you're marching down toward a transaction, it hasn't been signed yet by the seller, you know it's going to be signed tomorrow, let's say, or the next day. Do you see situations where the buyer's broker attempts to wind the inspector up ahead of time?
I think that all of us are communicating pretty regularly with home inspectors if we're writing any magnitude of offers, because you want to know what their time frames are looking like so that you can help pinpoint this time frame better. And every now and then, you know, there's lulls in the season. Maybe right now, today, 10 days would be okay because we're in the midst of the holiday season and maybe they're not as busy. Or maybe it's the opposite because they're booked with holiday and other things that are taking them away from their business. So actually, you know, to your point, Phil, I think that's a great idea, is be talking to those home inspectors and staying abreast of, and your handymen and your contractors, and, you know, what are their schedules look like.
Exactly. I'm thinking of a situation that I was involved in personally, and this was several years ago, but I was highly impressed with our broker, who was able to almost immediately secure a contractor that was specialized to do some particular work that needed to be done, not only from a standpoint of what a buyer would want, but what the lender was going to require of that buyer. So I think working with a tried and true group of inspectors and handymen and other people that are qualified, and working with them on a consistent basis so that you know that you have their loyalty and they know they have yours, will make it a lot easier to make arrangements to get them to come on board. How long does it take these days for an inspector in the Central Oregon area?
Oh, down in Bend, 4 or 5 business days is probably pretty realistic. A lot of them are working weekends now too, so that's taken some of the pressure off. And of course, just like in our industry with realtors, there are more and more home inspectors out there, licensed home inspectors. The question is who's worth using and who maybe isn't such a good choice.
Yeah. How long does it take to do the inspection typically and get the report back?
With today's technology, the report is usually received the day of the inspection, unless it happened to be really late in the day. The inspection itself depends on, to some degree, whether it's rural property and how big the home is, but anywhere from a couple hours up to 5 hours.
So you're talking about a same-day turnaround?
Yep, most of the time.
From the inspection to receipt of the report?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's really nice. It's not like the old days where they had to bring us a hard copy and run it down the street to us. Yeah,
I remember. That okay. So, and then I'm still looking at the sale agreement, professional inspection section. Then, and then it says that upon request by a seller or seller's agent, the buyer will promptly provide a copy of the report, etc. And that, of course, is a big issue. We'll talk about it later, but right now, all we're saying is that if the seller wants a copy of the report or a portion of the report, they're entitled to it. But the real question is whether or not it's going to be provided unilaterally, and the answer is no, it should not be, because it should be cleared first with the seller. And then secondly, that if there's going to be disapproval, that it has to be unconditional disapproval. Wendy, do you want to address this unconditional disapproval, because you've got a history of this being on the ORF Forms Committee?
Try not to laugh out loud, but you know, back in the day, if you remember, Phil, we used to have language in there that said that you could only disapprove of the inspection report if you identified a material defect.
Yes.
The material is like beauty in the eye of the beholder, and we learned through hard experience that that was pretty difficult to identify and get the parties to agree on what was material. So it seems simpler to make it just unconditional. But I think there are still some agents that struggle a little bit with what unconditional means. I see a lot of conditional, unconditional disapproval.
Yes.
I don't think the intent, so saying something like, buyer unconditionally disapproves of the home inspection unless the seller paints the living room wall.
Yes.
Is not unconditional disapproval.
So, I mean, take it one step further. If it's not unconditional disapproval, then if the inspection contingency period ran out and the seller didn't paint that wall, what's the status of the transaction?
If the seller didn't agree to paint the wall, then the buyer would have bought the property as is, and it says that very clearly in that inspection language.
Because it was not unconditional disapproval. So the point is, if you want to get out and you intend to get out, and the buyer makes it real clear that they want to get out, the only way you can do it is to unconditionally disapprove. And you don't have to give a reason for it. You don't have to say, I don't like the color of the wall or anything else. And you don't even have to use the word unconditional. You just don't want to put a condition in the disapproval.
Right.
I hereby disapprove of this transaction or the report, and I'm out of here. I mean, that's essentially the message that needs to be sent. Okay, and then of course at the tail end of this section is the language that says that if the buyer's agent doesn't unconditionally disapprove within the inspection contingency period, that means effectively that the buyer has waived their rights to use that as a right of termination, which means that at least as to the condition of the property, the buyer has accepted that property in its present condition, period. So you've got to make sure as a buyer's agent that you keep your eye on the ball, on the clock, so to speak, and that you and the agent on the other side know when that period is going to expire. I had a rather surprised buyer client recently who was counting the days, but this was before the form was changed to make it clear that that business days included, or excuse me, not business days, but that holidays included all holidays, state and federal. And formally it said that the holidays were the state holidays, and come to find out that Oregon doesn't recognize Thanksgiving or Columbus Day, excuse me, as a holiday. So it doesn't recognize Columbus Day as a holiday, and yet the federal government does. And so he was counting in Oregon, on an Oregon transaction, counting Columbus Day as one of the days that wasn't included, that it was a holiday, and he was wrong. So he was a day off on terminating his transaction because of that. Okay, the professional inspection addendum itself is exactly the same in terms of the time requirements. The one thing that we want to address here is this whole issue of what happens if you check one box versus all the boxes and all of those. This is probably the reason why a lot of buyers are not using this, is because there is some question about whether or not you can go back and get additional inspections. The takeaway here is that the professional inspection addendum, for those of you that don't use it, might want to consider at least using it as a punch list of potential inspections that you or your buyer may want to have on the property. Okay. All right. Now let's talk about the forms themselves and we'll look at the buyer's repair addendum first. Let's see if I can pull that up. Let's see. There's the buyer's repair addendum. Good. Okay. And I think in the outline, one of the first things we want to talk about is why timing is critically important. And I think just from the discussion so far, you can see how it is, because if a buyer does not adequately get the inspections and the negotiations completed within the inspection contingency period, they've got one of two choices: either extending it, getting extended, or alternatively walking from the transaction. In the form at line, let's see, I'm looking up at the top here. Line 6, it says, since there is no deadline for seller's acceptance in this proposal, the parties may wish to consider a written extension of any applicable inspection periods. So, Wendy, why is that in there? Why is there no deadline?
Well, I'm not sure what good a deadline would do. In fact, I hear agents occasionally will mention that they put deadlines in all sorts of addendums. You know, they'll ask for something and say seller has to respond by a certain time. Well, what's the penalty if they don't? So I think maybe it was left out just because it complicates things, and we have a deadline, we have an inspection contingency period that we're supposed to be working within, and trying to force the seller to comply with a different date perhaps doesn't make any sense.
Well, not only does it not make any sense, at least in the big picture, but you've already got, like you say, the inspection contingency period that expires. So now you're going to build a deadline within a deadline. And effectively then, looking at it from our perspective, we want to keep transactions together, not give an opportunity to terminate early. So rather than having the deadline in there for seller's acceptance of the buyer's proposal, the buyer's repair addendum, we essentially say that there is no deadline, and that the seller, if the seller does nothing within the inspection contingency period, then what happens? Seller does nothing.
Seller does nothing. If buyer does nothing either, then buyer's bought the property as is.
Okay, so silence is consent, right? So for buyer agents out there, I guess the issue is, what do you do if you're having trouble getting your seller's attention to respond to your requested repair? So how best should that be handled, Wendy?
Well, I think sometimes as agents we tend to insert ourselves as though we're the clients in a transaction, versus just reminding ourselves that we're here for guidance for our clients, and it's our job to make sure they know what their options are. And it does happen. We get down to the wire, maybe tomorrow's our inspection deadline, and we haven't heard from the seller, and the listing agent's gone silent or can't reach their seller for whatever reason. That conversation with the buyer is what's really important, explaining to them that they've got a couple of options. The first is to unconditionally disapprove prior to the deadline of 5 p.m. tomorrow and terminate the transaction. And that is an option that they should seriously consider if they are not willing to buy the property in its current condition. If they are, then we can take our chances and see if the seller responds or not. But giving them that choice, and I often recommend for our agents that if we're really dealing with a challenging seller or a situation where we know that we're getting close to a deadline, have the buyer sign that unconditional disapproval and hold on to it until just prior to the deadline, so that you're not trying to track your buyer down at the 11th hour, and have that prepared and ready to go to the seller's agent if you don't indeed get an acceptable seller's response prior to the deadline.
Good idea. Good idea. So I would imagine, as a supervising principal broker, that at least with some of the younger agents or newer agents, that you would be contacted by them when they say, I can't get a hold of the listing agent. They're making themselves unavailable. They're not responding. So how do you deal with that?
You know, I find it so frustrating in our industry that we even have to deal with it. But I teach some classes where I ask agents to raise their hand if they've ever had another agent not respond to them when they tried to reach them. And it's always unanimous that we've all run into that. And it's unfortunate because we do have timelines that we're trying to work within to get this taken care of. But typically what I will encourage our agents to do is reach out in every form possible. Call them on their cell phone, call them at the office, text them, email them, do everything they can to get a hold of them. If they really can't reach the listing agent, and it's not about the listing agent not reaching the seller, then I'll often get involved and call the other managing broker just to say, hey, you know, your agent is unavailable. Is everything okay? Do they have their eye on the ball? Where are we? And hopefully we can get some resolution that way.
And what has your experience been in regards to the other PB?
You know, I think of myself in that situation. It's like, oh, really? I just saw them this morning. You know, often it's just pure surprise. Of course, there's occasionally been some tragic event or something that's happened, but most of the time it's just an agent not taking seriously what is happening here. That there really are living people behind this contract going through a very emotional time, and trying to get this resolved sooner versus later is the best idea. And something else to the timeline, Phil, that we didn't touch on when you were talking about that drop dead date and timing and your own personal experience with a buyer who counted the days wrong. I encourage every agent right after acceptance to reach out to their the other agent, regardless of whether you're the buyer's agent or the seller's agent, and confirm the deadlines in the contract, because it's interesting how often we just simply make a mistake. We don't count a holiday. We do count a holiday that doesn't count. We mistakenly count the day the contract was signed, or we just simply count the days wrong. And so if we're all on the same page going into it, it sure saves a lot of agony when we get down to day 8 or 9 and one person is saying it's day 10 and the other one doesn't agree.
Well, and invariably the one that's wrong is on the short end of the stick, which can be fatal to a transaction. In fact, I don't know how I would explain it to my buyer that you lost this transaction because, or not lost a transaction. Here's what happens, to put a fine point on it. What happens is that if you miss the contingency period, then the seller has accepted the property in its as-is condition. Now, that doesn't mean the seller can't get out of the transaction. They can.
The buyer.
Excuse me, the buyer. But the only way they can get out of the transaction is by placing their earnest money at risk, or effectively losing the earnest money. So if the buyer's agent takes their eye off the ball and the contingency period expires, then that issue, the door on the condition of the property, the door is closed. Then the buyer's going to have to decide at that point that they want to stay in the transaction with the property being accepted in its as-is condition, or are they going to just walk and most likely give up their earnest money. If it's the latter, then you know ultimately who's going to be paying for that earnest money, and that is the buyer's agent that wasn't watching the clock. So ultimately, you should, I think, always look at whether you're a listing agent or a buyer's agent, look at the transaction from the standpoint of I own these contingencies. If there's a screw up, it's most likely going to cost me money. What Wendy talked about, getting together with the other side, making sure that you're reading off the same page. Do you have a form for that?
You know, that's funny you would ask that, because some of our agents have asked me to create one, and I haven't actually done it yet. But a number of our agents have their own forms that they use. It just says, you know, hey, Phil, thanks for putting this together. Here's what I see. Prom note, earnest money redemption is due this date. Home inspection contingency expires this date. You know, loan contingency expires this date, whatever the contingencies are. And I think it's an excellent idea, and I don't think it's a bad idea to have a form that confirms that between the realtors. It's not part of the transaction, but it certainly makes our lives easier. I think
it's an excellent idea. In fact, we have at ORF been asked to do a form like that. The commercial folks, at least in the Portland area, I think the commercial association does actually have a form that attempts to do something very similar, even though it's a commercial transaction, the concept is still the same, and that is just making sure that everybody is working off the same deadlines. Okay, let's see here. Still looking at the repair addendum. You know, if you're looking to get, you've got the repair addendum out there, and you can't get a hold of the seller, and you're butting up against the end of the contingency period, I'm going to submit that maybe you've done something wrong. You've waited too long. Because, like I said before, if you're selecting the 10 business days rather than 15, there's a reasonable chance in this marketplace that, given the difficulty in lining up contractors and such, that you're going to be exactly this situation at the end of the period, and you're going to be asking for an extension of time and be placed in this awkward situation. I think that, number one, you might consider intentionally creating a longer period of time, 15 days, for example, in order to do this so you're not put in this position. Now, it's still possible. The seller could not respond, even though the contingency period is say, 5 more business days. It's possible the seller could be playing games. The seller's got a better offer, and they would like nothing better than to see the transaction killed, which now gets down to, I think, the kind of discussion that has to be held with your buyer. So, Wendy, how do you prep your buyer for the unpleasantness of possibly having to deal with a sale, choosing between a sale fail and an as-is sale?
I think that conversation needs to be had with your buyer at the time they decide they want to write an offer on a property, maybe even before that. Buyers have to understand that they have certain rights in a transaction, but the seller has some rights too. And so don't go into a purchase with the expectation that the seller is going to make repairs. Go into the purchase with the expectation that all parties are going to act honestly and fairly and reasonably. But the reality is, if the seller has that other backup offer, they're probably not going to do any repairs. So when you make that offer, you have to know that you have the right to not go forward if you choose. But you don't have the right to force the seller to make repairs or even to respond to your request for repairs. And if you've already had that conversation with your buyer, when this comes up, it's a much easier conversation to have again by saying, remember we talked about this, turns out we got lucky and got a seller who's just not going to respond to us. So your choice is terminate or go forward with the property as is, and they should already be prepared for that.
All right. Now, $64 question. What would you do if you were the buyer's agent, or you were the PB for the buyer's agent, and it's a hot market, property is a great property, the major repair that's being requested is it's a semi-major repair, but it's not one that the bank wouldn't loan on. Okay. So what kind of discussion do you have with your buyer about this?
Well, in today's market, different conversation 5 years ago, but in today's market, I probably would be saying, this is probably the right thing to do by going forward. Probably don't want to lose the opportunity to own this home over a repair that you know can be made, just simply going to be coming out of your pocket versus someone else's. In a slower market where it's more of a buyer's market and the buyer has some leverage to negotiate a little bit harder, maybe you have a different conversation. But boy, today, I mean, it's not certainly, I think we all sense that we're, slowing down a little, maybe more so than just seasonally, but we can't tell yet, never can tell till it's behind you. But we're seeing some more properties expire, and we're seeing some price reductions and those types of things, and a little bit less multiple offers. But it's still, identifiably a seller's market, and probably they don't want to take that chance unless it's just a repair that they cannot live with. We all have trigger points. Maybe if I've had a bad experience with pest and dry rot in the past, I'm not willing to live with that. Maybe somebody else is.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, you're a buyer in a seller's market,
right.
And that's just a fact of life. The person that is behind you is just hoping that the deal will fail. And yet what could happen if the deal fails is the buyer, number two, is going to get your property. And they're not going to make an issue on that, and they'll be probably high-fiving each other that they got the property that you were afraid to buy. So there really has to be an analysis, I think, as to the materiality of the defect, shall we say, that is being sought to be repaired before you just make a knee-jerk reaction and jump out of the deal. That's I think something that you want to think twice about and have a good discussion with your broker that knows and understands what's going on in the marketplace right now. Moving toward the issue of the repairs themselves and a deadline coming up, do you see holdbacks much these days?
I'm really not seeing them, and what I'm being told by both lenders and title companies is that they're pretty resistant these days to doing them. There was a time, 5 or 10 years ago where holdbacks were not a big deal. I have to assume that it's got something to do with enough bad experiences from holdbacks that escrow doesn't want to hold the money, and lenders don't want to allow holdbacks for future repairs.
So how do you deal with it then?
The repairs are going to have to be either made before closing or, depending on the severity of the repair and whether the lender requires it to be made prior to closing, one solution that we've come up with is having the seller go ahead and pay the contractor for the repairs in advance so that the buyer is assured that the repairs are going to be done if it's something that just can't be done prior to closing.
Have you had any problems with that?
Haven't actually run into a problem with that. So, of course, I can count on both hands how many times I've done it, too. So it's probably just the luck so far that we haven't had an issue.
Well, okay, but essentially what you're saying is that the seller pays, but the buyer is going to manage the repair. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, what happens if the repair person doesn't do the work? You haven't seen that, but just I want to take it one step further, because I think, first of all, it's only going to take once for a contractor to screw over a seller and not do the work they've been prepaid for. I mean, that I think would get around so fast that they'd be tarred and feathered.
Yeah, out of business.
So I don't really see that as a problem. What I do see, and we didn't discuss this, but what I do see is a little bit of a drafting issue. Because while I think it's a good solution to the holdback alternative, it's a good solution, assuming you know who you're dealing with. But I would ask, well, who's going to be responsible if the work isn't properly done? You see, if I'm a seller, I'll say to the buyer, okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'll prepay this. It's agreed that I have met my responsibility to you, Mr. Seller. But going forward, you have full responsibility for this and full supervision of this contractor. And I am no longer responsible for what the contractor does because you're going to be supervising. And in fact, I'm handing off the baton to you, Mr. Buyer. And I think that is something that ought to find its way into some kind of an agreement or an addendum or something, so that in the off chance that either the contractor doesn't do the work or more likely does the work, does it poorly, that the seller is off the hook.
I agree. I really appreciate that input, Phil, because we do run into things where we don't think the whole thing through, and that's a really good point. If I'm the seller and I've written that check, please don't come back to me and ask me to do something else later because you're not happy with whatever ended up happening. Yeah.
So, but that's what I guess the takeaway here is that while you may hit upon a great solution, take it one step further to see how solid that solution will apply in the event of Murphy's Law, in the event that something, the doomsday scenario, I like to say, that the unanticipated occurs, and you as the broker have have suggested this alternative, but you don't have anything in writing that suggests or that says how it's going to be handled on a going forward basis. I'm going to, as a parenthetical, I want to talk about what I hear so many times realtors say that I'm not an attorney, I can't draft documents, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you draft addenda all the time, and it's not the practice of law. The practice of law is specific, and if you're in the course of professional real estate activity, writing addenda and so on, that's perfectly fine. It's not the practice of law, but you've got to avoid ambiguity when you're drafting. So just make sure that while you're perfectly within your rights to draft it, that you want to draft it in such a manner that it's clear to everybody. How you determine whether or not something is ambiguous is actually pretty simple. You draft it. You draft what you think represents the agreement of the parties, and then you take that writing and you go to a stranger, not a stranger, like somebody on the street, but no, but somebody who is a stranger to the transaction that says, and you say to them, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Take a look at the four corners of this document and tell me whether or not you understand what it says, what it's attempting to accomplish. And if that person with no familiarity with the history of the transaction says, here's what I understand. You're doing X, and you're doing Y, you're doing Z. And if, in fact, that's what you're trying to accomplish, then the document, in my opinion, is free from ambiguity, meaning that somebody who is a stranger to the transaction understands exactly what it is. Whereas if you have to explain that, no, it's not this and that, it's X, Y, and Z. Now all of a sudden you have ambiguity. So you haven't avoided ambiguity. If you have ambiguity in your document, you're going to have a problem. So try to make sure that whatever it is you draft, and particularly on these critical post-closing arrangements, that in fact it's clear to everybody. And if alternatively, when I say a stranger, your principal broker, your managing PB should be able to help you in that regard. Okay, repairs, corrective actions. Let's talk about that for a minute. One of the things, and I guess I just addressed it, was how you draft the provisions in the repair addendum as to what it is you want. Wendy, what do you do?
I happen to be married to a handyman, and so I get to be that stranger a lot who he calls into his office and says, read this repair addendum and tell me what it is they actually want. And that's something that I think happens as a matter of course because we rely so much on the home inspection document. So you're sitting there with your buyer and you're drafting the addendum and it says something about the hot water heater, repair or replace. So you write in repair or replace per home inspection. That doesn't give the seller or their hired help any direction on what you actually want done. So I would just encourage everybody to keep in mind that to avoid later arguments about the expectation, to make sure that you're very specific in what you want done. If you want the wall painted beige, name the color beige that you want it painted. If you want something repaired, if it can be repaired and if not replaced, then say that way so that it's very, very clear to the seller what the expectation is so that they can get estimates and make an educated decision on what they will or will not do.
Good point. And as you and I talked about earlier, what you said to me was don't just quote the exact language in the inspection report, but actually pinpoint what it is that you want to accomplish and put that into the addendum. So if repair and replace doesn't say enough, that you want to say more and put yourself in the shoes really of the reader of that. Are they going to understand what it is that you're asking for? And you as the broker with the pen or essentially typing it are going to have the responsibility to make it clear. Because the more clarity you have, the less ambiguity, the less confusion, and the less confusion, the faster things will get done. I think that's important. Okay. Let's see here. What if there's a question whether the completion date is going to occur within the contingency deadline period, which, as we've discussed already, is almost born to failure if you're doing 10 business days and there's going to be a lot of repairs. So how do you deal with it, Wendy? I mean, if you, for example, if you start to see a problem, let me put it this way, I'm going to suggest the answer, and that is about being proactive. What do you suggest or recommend that folks do?
You know, it's interesting because when you think about even just writing an offer, it's the buyer's agent writing an offer, and you're trying to answer questions you don't have the answers to yet. When you're writing a buyer's repair addendum, you're identifying a completion date before anybody's done any investigation. So it's kind of throwing a dart, and I can tell you that rarely would I ever see a completion date that would fall still within the inspection contingency period. And I'm not sure that it's relevant one way or the other, because once we've agreed to this repair addendum, the inspection contingency is satisfied anyway. So, you know, likely it's going to be some period of time down the road. The only thing I would say is for sellers' agents to keep their eye on what that date is at the time they're having their seller consider accepting or countering the repair addendum, because if, again, it's not even the buyer's agent's fault. They're throwing a dart. But if you pick up the phone and call a contractor to get an estimate, and they can't even come out to see the problem before that completion date is scheduled, then you need to do a counter proposal and extend that timing for completion.
All right. Well, I think a lot of this goes to what I would call, at least in our business, a professional courtesy. As soon as you see or have a hint that there's going to be, and in this market there's plenty of hints, that there's going to be delay. There's going to be delay, particularly if you're trying to get a contractor, a licensed contractor in, and you don't even know what their availability is. How far backed up are they? And even though you don't know how far backed up they are, I would submit that it's not a bad idea to have a discussion with your counterpart to say, look, it looks like we're going to need to have a few more days, because I understand that the contractors are backed up, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think about us just going ahead and agreeing, or at least talking about with your client, agreeing to an extension of time if it becomes necessary? So effectively, the listing agent goes back to their seller and say, this may be a possibility. Are you okay with that? And most likely the seller would say, well, okay, but let's just not give it to them until they ask, which is fair. But rather than coming out of the blue when the seller thinks that everything is smooth sailing and it really isn't, and then asking at the 11th hour, that's where you run into problems, and particularly in this market if there's a potential backup already in the offing. Okay, so let's talk about the report itself. What are you seeing in at least in the Central Oregon area? I can comment on the metro area anyway, about the pros and cons of turning over the report.
I think there's a lot of confusion, and it's funny because there's confusions on both sides of the issue. There are those buyer's agents who are in the habit of sending the inspection report along with the repair addendum every time, which isn't the right thing to do, as we know, because the language specifically says, don't send it to me unless I ask for it. And then there's the other extreme where you have the buyer's agents who take the position that it's my report, I paid for it, and you don't have any right to it, which is also incorrect because the language clearly says I do have a right to it as a seller if I want to see it. My personal advice to a seller, or professional advice, I guess, is that, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and so better to not see it, if at all possible, unless you've got a seller who's just really one of those people who says, nope, I want to see it, I want to fix everything, I'm good with it. Better not to have that knowledge that you then have to disclose to the next client should this transaction not stay together.
Yeah, and there are people, folks on the other side of that argument, that think it is a mortal sin for the seller to decline to get a copy of the report. I think that legally I would have difficulty in seeing any liability to a seller who didn't ask for something they didn't have a right to. Or to put it another way, who didn't ask for something they didn't have to ask for, all right? If the seller doesn't have to ask for the report, can they be held liable for not asking? And the answer is no, simply. No, they can't. The question really gets down to how important is the seller seeing that report. Is there any portion of that report that needs to be seen by the seller? And the discussion, I guess, is with your seller. If you can do the work without seeing the report, is that not better than getting a full-blown report, particularly on issues that you're not even, they're not germane to the discussion itself? So I'm generally okay with the concept of sellers not asking for a report, assuming that they can get the work done without it. But keep in mind that if they're asked to do X, Y, and Z, and they don't have a report, the transaction fails for some reason, the seller now has knowledge, at least as to the potential existence of X, Y, and Z, and would have to disclose it on a going forward basis. Seller cannot close their ears to the reality of the transaction up to the date of the sale fail. What is your thinking about having a property inspected by a seller before they put the property on the market?
That one's a catch-22, no question about it. They now have knowledge, can't plead ignorance. They have to disclose what they find out. And then, secondarily, the seller's property disclosure requires that any whole home inspection be shared with a buyer if it was conducted in the last 3 years. Well, if you don't have it, that's different. But if you did it yourself, you have it, so you now need to share it, even if you've made the repairs. And then finally, every inspector calls out something different. So you may have a home inspection report that comes back pretty clean, and you fixed a couple of things that you think, all right, now I'm good to go. And then you end up with another issue called out by the next inspector anyway. So I'm not sure I would want to express that it's necessarily a good or a bad thing. I think it just varies from personality to personality.
Well, I think you're being generous because I think it's risky.
Perfect.
I think it's risky. I think it's risky because of exactly what Wendy said. I mean, you're getting a double whammy. You're going to have to turn it over, number one. And number two, there's a good chance that the buyer's inspection report will say additional things. And number three, you're now on notice of all of these things that you weren't even looking for. I would probably, if I were listing a property, or at least if I was selling a property, I wouldn't have a pre-listing inspection, I don't believe, unless there was some compelling reason to do so. Okay, let's talk about one issue that probably is not on the forefront of everybody's radar, and that's Oregon Revised Statute 701.005, paren 5. 701.005, paren 5. And let me see if I can read that. This is the portion of the law that deals with the Construction Contractors Board, and it says a contractor means any of the following. It says, number a person that for compensation or with the intent to sell arranges or undertakes or offers to undertake or submits a bid to construct, alter, repair, add on to, subtract from, etc., 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 any real estate. Any property or improvement attached to real estate. Okay, that's the summary of it. So basically, if you arrange, even though you're not undertaking to do the work, you are under the CCB definition of 701.005, you are a contractor. Now, has anybody? Is this a hanging offense? Is it, because at least as Wendy says, the vast majority of listing agents are out there doing that sort of thing. They're the ones that are lining up the contractors. Well, in the eyes of the CCB, what you're doing is you're acting as a general contractor because you're arranging for bids. To do work on the property. So, does that mean that you shouldn't do it? No, I'm not going to go that far to say you shouldn't do it. But technically, from a hyper-technical standpoint, in a perfect world, which this is not, one would say, well, so to be perfectly compliant, you would probably want to make sure that your seller is giving you the instructions to do these things. So you're not arranging for subcontractors to do work. you are simply acting as a conduit, just the same as if your seller called, but your seller isn't doing it. You're calling on behalf of the seller. See, sellers don't need a license, contractor's license, to make these arrangements. But if you're doing it as a third person, technically, the law says that you have to. I'm not going to get too in depth on that. The only exception is property management. The property managers are entitled to do some minor arranging and so on and being exempt. But it's just an aside, and there are some people that look at this, brokers, with more seriousness than others, but most brokers, in my experience, are totally unfamiliar with that. I think the greater issue when you're arranging this, though, is what I refer to as negligent referral. If you get a contractor out there on behalf of your seller to do work and you don't know the first thing about that contractor, and the contractor does a poor job, you may have an issue. And to put a fine point on this, let me explain the situation where it really brings it home. So the listing agent gets a contractor out to remove the paint from a garage. Well, it turns out that the paint was lead-based paint, and the listing agent hired this guy who didn't know what he was doing and didn't know lead-based paint from, I don't know, any other kind of paint. And so he went ahead and started sanding it off, which then turns it into what's called friable material, and all that lead is now friable and floating through the air. And of course, the neighbor just went crazy and was threatening to bring a claim, a lawsuit against the realtor for having this guy do the work. So bottom line is, make sure you know who you're dealing with, that your contractor or the handyman knows what they're doing before you just allow them to do the job. And Wendy, you and I had an interesting discussion a little bit ago about the seller doing the work, because this doesn't say necessarily that the seller can't do the work. So let's address that for a second. What kind of situations can arise?
You know, it's interesting because the language in the buyer's repair addendum says that if the work requires a license, then a licensed person should be used. But it's not very specific, and so we often get into a lot of interpretation about what can the seller do on their own and what actually requires a contractor to be present and doing it instead. You know, I'm not sure I know the right answer to that question, but I take something as simple, it sounds like, as simple as smoke alarms. Your average seller probably thinks they're competent to go ahead and replace out the smoke alarms, but the sale agreement specifically says they'll meet today's code. Well, the odds are good the seller doesn't know what today's code is. So even if they can physically go in and even hardwire a smoke alarm, they may not know that they're missing some because their home was constructed at a time when code was different than it is today. So I always feel like, you know, if it's something as a buyer's agent that you're not sure that you would want the seller doing, that perhaps you identify that specifically next to the repair. Do you think is that okay to do that?
Yeah, you bet. And I can't think of a better example than smoke alarms or carbon monoxide, those sorts of things. I know what my skill limits are, and I couldn't even put in a battery operated one, much less hardwired, at least not without electrocuting myself. So I think that's very, very smart. The language I'm looking at and that Wendy's referring to is line 28. Unless otherwise provided above, all repair/corrective or actions requiring the use of contractors, e.g. for electrical, HVAC, plumbing, or similar specialty work. Now you see, and when I drafted this, I wanted to make sure that we were talking and giving examples of specialty work. So if it's non-specialty work, the things for which somebody does not have to be a CCB contractor, such as fixing the squeaky doors or leveling things or
securing handrails, that comes up a lot.
Yeah, securing handrails. So that's something else. And you're right. It's maybe, I don't know if it could be more specific, but I know it's general, and that is if it requires specialty work, they got to be licensed and bonded. If it's not specialty work, I still recommend that you use somebody that's competent and that's familiar with doing that kind of work. So that's a kind of a interesting issue. And back to the drafting, you had given an example, Wendy, for this webinar of a situation where the buyer failed to specify exactly how they wanted the repair done. Just that it had to do with the steps.
You know, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where you want to be as specific as possible when you're identifying repairs. We had a situation where there was a garage man door to the exterior side yard that was a little bit high off the ground. I don't remember exactly, 16 inches or something like that. And the seller had thrown a wooden crate outside the door that they'd been using for years to step down onto and then down onto the dirt. And the home inspector called that out and said that there should be a permanent step there. So the buyer's agent copied the home inspector's language, and it basically said there should be a permanent step there. And the seller agrees to install it. So the seller lag bolted the crate to the foundation. And in their opinion, that met the standard of a permanent step. Now, we can laugh, but the bottom line is that we had an argument where there didn't need to be an argument if it had been more specifically identified, like pour a concrete step or have a licensed contractor come out and build a permanent step or some sort of something that just made it a little bit clearer what exactly you were looking for.
So you have a permanent apple box on the side of the house.
Exactly.
It's bolted to the foundation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Great. Yeah.
There you go.
Yes.
That was a perfect example of, it's kind of one of those where you just walk out and scratch your head and go, how do we argue about this? We weren't specific. It's permanent. You know, how far do we want to take this? Who wants that argument? Yeah.
Okay. Alternatives to the paper chase. Is there a better way? Wendy, how, if you have a series of items called out in an inspection report, and let's assume that they're not monumental, but there's a lot of them, how would you recommend addressing that?
I always think having the listing and selling broker, buyer and seller's agent talking together will simplify things in advance. It's amazing how much we can get resolved just by running ideas past each other and finding out things that maybe we didn't know previously. So, buyer's agent calls the listing agent and says, hey, my buyer's thinking about asking for this, this, and this. How do you think your seller's going to respond to that? Oh, my seller doesn't have time for any of that. They live in Alaska. Could we do a credit instead? Try to resolve some things before you're creating a monumental paper trail going back and forth.
Well, you say a paper trail. What's wrong with paper trails? I'm in the business of paper trails.
You're probably really good at it too. The challenge is that, depending on the lender, they may want to see all of those documents going back and forth about repairs. So then when you finally wind up doing a credit for closing costs instead of repairs, the lender is a little red flagged maybe about all of those things that they know didn't get done on the home.
So you don't want to write an addendum that says that the seller will credit the buyer $1,000 for repairs. No, definitely the lenders won't allow credits for repairs, only credits towards closing costs. Okay, so the credit for closing costs then essentially takes the place of this long paper trail of offer, or seller repair addendum, buyer repair addendum, seller response, seller wants to make a counter to the buyer's, and it gets back and forth, and all of this is a part of the transaction. Keep in mind that these addenda are in fact a part of the sale agreement. They're incorporated by reference. So technically, when the lender says, I want to see the sale agreement, the question is whether or not you're going to hold back on documents that are actually a part of the sale agreement. And my suggestion is, and I think this is Wendy's too, is before you go down that path, talk to your lender or the mortgage broker. What is it that you want me to provide? We had a discussion about this in Sun River at the OER annual convention, and the lender there says, I don't want to see all this stuff. That's fine. If the lender says that, then you don't have to provide it. If the mortgage broker says it, I suppose that's fine, because the mortgage broker is really kind of an agent of the lender. But I don't recommend withholding anything without at least a confirmation in email. So I would send that lender or mortgage broker a confirmation that simply says, we'll go per our discussion. We're going to go ahead and send you the sale agreement. We understand that you do not want copies of the repair addenda, etc., something like that. It doesn't have to be too complicated, but we want to have something in the file that makes it clear that you're not holding back on documents with this lender, because, and I've done this, if you look up the definition of mortgage fraud under the federal statutes, you will see that looking sideways at the mortgage broker is actionable. I mean, I'm being facetious, but it is so broad that almost anything that you put your signature to is in fact, or could be, construed to be mortgage fraud. And these are federal laws. This is because they're federally regulated lenders. So I would, before I would hold back on any of these important documents, I would make sure that it's confirmed. Because if it ever got down to he said versus she said as to what the lender told you, I'd a lot rather have it in writing than not. Definitely. Okay. Let's see. What happens if you've negotiated down and you decide you're going to do closing costs and prepaids, but the seller already agreed that would be part of the transaction at the front end?
I can't tell you how often this has come up for me here recently. I'm not sure what it is, but we're seeing a lot of transactions in Central Oregon where the buyers, unless it's cash, are asking for the seller to contribute towards closing costs. And in most cases, they're asking for the maximum amount allowable under the terms of the loan that they're getting. Excuse me. So what happens then is you've lost any ability to gather additional credits for repairs. So it puts you in a position of either accepting the property as is or expecting the seller to make the repairs, which in some cases can be, nearly impossible. So it's just something to think about when you're writing your offer. If you're asking for seller contributions to closing costs, that if you ask for the maximum amount, you no longer have the ability to get anything else later in the transaction.
What on this repair addendum, what's your suggestion in regards to which particular repairs you would ask for? Let's say that the inspection report, it's a garden variety inspection report, but let's say there's 15 line items ranging from significant to insignificant. How do you deal with it?
Especially in this market, I think it goes back to having that conversation with your buyer up front, that anytime you can avoid having the seller counter a proposal, and then that's what you want to do. So if you write a repair addendum that has a couple of significant or seemingly significant repairs that you need to have done, the front door doesn't seal properly, the door doesn't latch. We actually had one of those recently. That's significant. I can't lock my home. We also had an inspector actually call out missing screws in the hinge on some doors in the home. If you start asking for those kind of things, you're more likely then to get pushback on the things that you really do want. So be careful in what you ask for, and a whole laundry list of things. We all think our homes are special. All of us, even me, even you, Bill. We think our homes are special, and to have somebody present you with a 17-item list of things that are wrong with your home is offensive. And so don't do that to yourself or your client by saying, oh, they're all minor, though. Just ask for the things that really matter.
Yeah. Now, you gave, when we were talking before, you gave a pretty good example. I think it had to do with an oven that needed to be repaired or replaced. Essentially, that was the most important of the items, and they went down in terms of significance and materiality. So if you have the big ticket item, and then you've got 5 other items that are minor, you could see a counteroffer from the seller that says, I'll do the 5 minor items, but not the big ticket item. That's far different. That's far different than saying I want the range replaced, repaired, or whatever has to be done, and be specific. And forget the little items. That's what I call walking over dollars to pick up pennies. You don't want to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's look at So let's assume we got this completed in the middle here, the repairs of corrective action, and you put in here a period of time. And Wendy said something that I'm going to go back and underscore. If you put in here the completion date for repairs / corrective action, and let's say you put a date in that is well beyond the inspection contingency period, okay? What Wendy said, and it may have, some of you may have missed it, but she said, if that's where you are and the completion date is beyond the inspection contingency period, then effectively that condition, the inspection contingency period condition, has been met.
Right.
Okay, and what that means is, and we'll talk about it here in a minute, that if problems occur in the completion of those items, that is outside of the inspection contingency period, which means then that this is not a case of a waiver or something like that, that the buyer is waiving certain rights because that inspection contingency has already been removed or satisfied by reason of the seller saying, yes, I'll do those, and I'll do them on a date that's outside of the completion date is outside of the conclusion of the inspection contingency period.
So am I understanding you correctly? You're saying that once the seller's accepted this, then I can't unconditionally disapprove later.
No. Okay. No, and that's what I think we want to talk about next is the seller's response, and that is it's pretty simple here. It gives a place for a seller to make a counter proposal. And you can see down here the warning. It says that the inspection contingency, if it's not properly extended, that you could have an issue. Now, the reason that this warning is here, and it's also I think in the buyer's requested or the buyer's repair addendum, is because what we're trying to tell brokers is that if you haven't completed your negotiations within the inspection contingency period, then, and that period expires, then you have waived the contingency. Mm-hmm. So now you're in the transaction, you're accepting the property, it's as is condition, and the only way to get out of it, short of a financing issue, the only way to get out of it is going to be with losing the earnest money. So it says at line 27, unless otherwise provided above, all repairs, corrective action requiring the use of contractors, and so on, shall be performed by Oregon licensed and bonded contractors, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to make sure that within that inspection contingency period, you've got these people lined up, and that there is no further issue in regards to what work is going to be done. So if you're the buyer's agent and you get a seller's response here to the repair addendum, and you've got to be very, very careful to either proactively get this extended or have the discussion with your client about how they want to proceed. Now let's assume that we are already there. Everybody understands what has to be done. It's going to be done, and it's going to be done outside of the inspection contingency period. Outside of the inspection contingency period.
Which is typical.
Which is typical. Mm-hmm. And so that means that the events, or I shouldn't say the events, but the remedies under the inspection contingency period are by the board. They don't apply anymore. And so the buyer is not quote unquote locked in. The seller's already agreed, and so you don't have to worry about the expiration of the inspection contingency period. But let's say now the work is being done, and there is language at line 33 and 34 of the buyer repair addendum that says seller shall give buyer or buyer's agent written notice of completion of the repair's corrective action, and buyer may, with buyer inspector, within blank business days, if not filled in, following receipt of such notice, re-inspect to confirm that the repairs, et cetera, have been completed. Now, this is the issue at number 5, re-inspections of a process without a remedy. Wendy, how do you deal with that?
Well, I think again, so much of it has to do with preparing your buyer for the reality of what's to come, and that is that you have the right to go back and take a look and make sure the repairs were done, but you don't have any additional remedy available to you under the terms of the contract. You certainly can have the right to ask or comment on the quality of the work or whatever, but if the work isn't done or it isn't done correctly, there's going to be a whole separate argument because this form doesn't specifically address what happens next.
Okay, and so what are your options, alternatives?
This is always where I feel a little bit insecure, and always want to make sure that I talk to somebody like yourself to confirm. But basically there are two options. The buyer can refuse to close and say, Mr. Seller, if you don't do these things or do them right, then I'm going to sit tight until you do. I always feel like that's risky because you're claiming the seller's in breach, but then are you in breach too because you haven't closed on time? Or you go ahead and close and then go back to small claims court after the fact and say, Mr. Seller didn't do these things that he agreed in writing to do, and therefore I have been damaged and deserve X number of dollars.
Yep. And line 34 gives a right to reinspect, but you'll see that it doesn't say anything about if that reinspection determines that the repairs were inadequate. Now, some people could say, well, Quaren, why didn't you finish your thought? Why didn't you put in here a provision that set those things out? And there may be a school of thought that would say that should be in there. But let me submit that there is a place for ambiguity, and this is one of them. If we had a continuous set of protocols for what happens after the reinspection, all of a sudden what we're doing now is either extending the closing date or having some alternative remedy above and beyond what it is that is contained in the four corners of the document. And so really what this allows by saying nothing is it allows the parties to make a determination as to what it is that they want to do. The two alternatives are, as Wendy pointed out, one is standing firm and saying, I'm not going to close with you until you get this these repairs done correctly. I think that's risky. I agree with Wendy. I think it's risky because, number one, there's nothing at line 34 it says that. It just says the buyer has a right to reinspect. It doesn't say what happens if the buyer is not happy. So if the buyer says, I'm not going to close, then if that closing date blows by, the buyer's got a problem. Surely the issue will get into some form of mediation arbitration, and I think needlessly so. If the property is worth purchasing, it's worth keeping the transaction going, which I suggest is to go ahead and close the transaction, and you've not waived your inspection contingency because that thing closed already. Remember, it's already closed. This is not within the inspection contingency period. The buyer doesn't have any right or ability to say I'm in or I'm out. It's already gone. And they have not waived the right to later object on this reinspection. So you go ahead and close the transaction, and then, depending on the magnitude of the failure, then decide whether or not you're going to pursue that. Now, Wendy said small claims court, and that would be my hope that the inadequacy, the work that wasn't performed, is small claims court stuff. And I would suggest that if it's a $500 item, that you think to yourself about the value of your time versus going into small claims court for $500. But the jurisdictional limits up to $10,000. If we're talking about thousands of dollars, I think it certainly is worth pursuing. But there is a legal option, a legal solution available post-closing, and that would probably be the best way to go. If there's any doubt about that, why the seller and or the buyer can go ahead and get legal advice as to how to proceed. But you do not, under any circumstances, want to let that closing date expire or go by without addressing that issue.
So, Phil, just quickly, if I were going to go ahead and close, and I'm feeling like I'm definitely not happy with the results of that repair, probably I should have my agent at least send an email or something. Shouldn't I have some paper trail that says I did try to resolve this prior to closing, but I couldn't get it resolved?
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. I mean, if you never say to the seller, I don't like the repairs that you had done, and then go into small claims court, I think you're going to look a little silly. So you're right. You want to definitely have something that says that this wasn't done properly. Is your client willing, after closing, to fix this? And now, all of a sudden, you've teed up the small claims court case in the event that the seller says no, which is what you get. I'm not going to do any more work. Close the transaction or pound sand. And the seller says, okay, fine, or buyer, okay, I'll go ahead and close the transaction, but you haven't heard the last of this, and then go ahead and make the decision. But yes, you want to have a bit of a paper trail so that shows that the buyer made a good faith effort to get the seller to comply, and I think that's wise. We've got, it looks like, about 30 seconds. I
don't see any questions.
I was just going to suggest, though, point out the issue of what you do when the seller has a counter proposal to the buyer's repair addendum. And I think the only thing I want to suggest is don't make it too complicated. When you have offers and counter offers flying back and forth on repair, better to start all over again. Terminate the addenda and then supersede it by something that says that these are the terms that the parties agree to on the inspection repairs, and be done with it in one single page. It avoids ambiguity, it avoids confusion, and it'll make the transaction close a lot faster and clearer.
Which is why we have that form set up the way that it is. That seller's response, the seller's repair addendum only has two options for the buyer: accept it or reject it and start over.
That's right.
It helps us all to not have to go back and try to track from one addendum to the next, to the next, to the next, what actually was agreed to and what was not.
So lines 39 and 40 of the seller's response is what we're talking about. They're italicized. Okay, I think with that, we are through with this webinar. Thank you very much, Wendy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Phil.
Okay.
It's been a pleasure.